Starting now.
Black Clock Audio Tales, May 2019, Hawaiian Folklore and Legends, edited by Daniel Spitzer, music by Kevin MacLeod. Help the show by sharing, rating, liking, or 5-star giving wherever you listen to or rate podcasts. Support the show by hitting the Patreon button on pgttcm.podbean.com or by going to paypal.me/pgttcm, and don't forget to visit pgttcm.com. Brought to you by BunnySlippers.com. Check out their new Dino Sound Slippers. Is that the name? They roar every third step. Very cool.
Kayanna, the last of the Hawaiian Knights, Part 2. Kamehameha, Kaku Manu, Captain Cook, and the Final Conquest, Part 4. With this somewhat extended reference to Kamehameha and the prominent chiefs of his time, which brings the tracings of public events down to the eve of the concluding struggle of the conquest, we will now return to Kayanna, through whose relations with Kamehameha some curious glimpses of the domestic life of the latter are brought to view. We have thus far seen him as a warrior. We will now observe him as a husband, whose peace was disturbed by jealousies, and whose heart, stern in all things else, was not proof against the tender influences of love. At the close of his unsuccessful campaign against the chiefs of Hilo and Kau, in 1785, Kamehameha took up his residence at Kahula, where he devoted himself for a time to more peaceful pursuits. To stimulate his people to industry, he gave his personal attention to agriculture, and the piece of ground cultivated with his own hands is still pointed out. Continuous wars had impoverished his possessions, and he was anxious to restore to productiveness his neglected lands. Up to this time, Kamehameha had two recognized wives, Kaloa and Pelui. This Kalola was not the widow of Kali and Ipu, although bearing a similar name. She was a granddaughter of Kauai, king of Hawaii. Pelui was the daughter of Kama'anawa, brother of Keeaumoku, and one of his staunchest supporters. For some months, Kamehameha lived quietly at Kahua. The inspired song of Keeaumoku, who had died the year before, predicting that he would become the sovereign of the group, still rang in his ears, and in the midst of their labors, his people were encouraged in the practice of the manly games and pastimes which added to their strength, skill, and endurance in war. Sham fights on land and sea, and swimming, diving, wrestling, running, and leaping contests were frequent, and during the annual feast of Lono, beginning with the winter solstice and continuing for 5 days, a tournament was given which brought to Kahola the leading chiefs of Hamakua, Kohala, and Kona. Among them was the famous Keeaumoku, who had charge of the district of Kona. He was accompanied by his family, of which his daughter, Kaku Manu, was the most attractive feature. 20 years before, Keeaumoku, who was of the royal line, rebelled against Kali Ipu, and was defeated and forced to find refuge on Maui, whose moi, Kamuhueni, had died but a few days before, leaving the government to his brother Kahiliki. Keeaumoku, whose fortunes were desperate, succeeded in captivating and marrying Namahana, the widow of the deceased king, very much to the chagrin and disappointment of Kahiliki, whose claim to the dowager was sustained by the royal custom of the time. A difficulty followed, and Keeaumoku and his wife took up their residence on the northern side of the island. But they were not permitted to remain there in peace. Through the hostility of Kaliliki, they were driven to Molokai and thence to the district of Hana in eastern Maui, which was then held by the king of Hawaii, and there, through the mercy of Kalaniʻopuʻu, they were allowed for some years to reside, and there, in 1768, Kaku Manu was born. On the death of Kalaniʻopuʻu in 1782, Keeaumoku returned to Hawaii, and in the war for the succession exposed the cause of Kamehameha and became one of his chief counselors and captains. Kahamunu was one of the most attractive women of her time, and inherited something of the restless and independent spirit of her warlike father. She was in her 18th year when she made her appearance at the court of Kamehameha during the festival of Lono in 1785. The wives of Kamehameha were well along in years, Peleuli being the mother of a full-grown son, and Kaku Manu charmed the great chief with her freshness and independence. His warlike soul yielded to the fascination, and to win her smile he took part in the contests of the festival and overcame all competitors. He then proposed to make her his wife. Keeaumoku readily consented, but Kaku Manu could only be won by the promise that her children should become the political heirs of Kamehameha. This promise was given, and Kaku Manu became the wife of Kamehameha. It is probable that he intended to observe the compact at his time, but as Kaku Manu died childless, he was in the end left to dispose of the succession through other and more distinguished channels. Kaku Manu became the wife of Kamehameha's heart. He loved her as well as he was capable of loving any woman, and she was the only one whose indiscretions were regarded by him with feelings of jealousy. His other wives were not restricted by him to his sole attentions, and even the blue-blooded Keopuolani, whom he subsequently married, and who became the mother of his heirs to the throne, had a joint husband in Hoapili. But the affections of Kaku Manu Kamehameha would brook no joint occupant or rival. She doubtless sought to avail herself of the privileges of the times, but Kamehameha objected with a frown which would have meant death to another, and for years their relations were the reverse of harmonious. Deanna's father was Ahua, who was the son of Kauai, king of Hawaii, by a mother whose name is now unknown. The mother of Deanna was Kaupu Kamou, a granddaughter of Ahia, of the family of Hilo, from whom the present sovereign of the islands draws his strain. The birthplace of Deanna is not recorded, but he was probably reared in the neighborhood of Hilo, and thoroughly instructed in all the chiefly accomplishments of the period. He grew to a splendid manhood. He was nearly 6.5 feet in height, very well proportioned, and possessed a striking, handsome face. This is the testimony of Captain Mears, with whom he made a voyage to China in 1787. Deanna was of high rank and boundless ambition, and in early manhood cast his fortunes with Kahiliki, the warlike moi of Maui, to whom he was related. He was among the prominent chiefs who assisted Kahiliki in his conquest of Oahu in 1783, and took a distinguished part in the decisive battle of Kahiliki. Kahanaana, the unfortunate king of Oahu, escaped to the hills, where he remained secreted for nearly 2 years, when he was betrayed by the brother of his wife and slain by order of Kahiliki. This cruel treatment of Kahanaana, together with the rapacity of the invaders, created a revulsion of feeling among the Oahu chiefs, and a widespread conspiracy was organized by the father of Kahana and others against Kahiliki and the Maui chiefs, to whom had been assigned lands in the several districts of the island. The plan was to rise in concert and kill them all in one night, including Kahiliki. But the murderous project miscarried. By some means it became known to Kahiliki, and he dispatched messengers to the threatened chiefs, warning them of their danger. All but one of them were notified. The messenger failed to reach Hiu, who was at Wailoa, and he was killed, but fearfully was his death avenged. Kahiliki collected his forces for a war for blood. Men, women, and children were butchered without mercy, and the native Oahu chiefs were almost extirpated. So great was the slaughter that one of the Maui chiefs built a house at Lapike, the walls of which were laid up with the bones of the slain. In this rebellion, a number of Kahiliki's own chiefs turned against him. Among were Deanna and Kanionu, the latter being the first husband of Kamakahilili, Queen of Kauai. What incited the defection of Deanna is not known, but he was probably dissatisfied with the lands apportioned to him by Kahiliki, and hoped to profit from the restoration of the island to native rule. Kanionu was killed, but Deanna managed to escape to Kauai. Kanionu was of the royal line of Kauai, and as already stated, the first husband of the queen of that island. How he came to be a supporter of Kahiliki in his conquest of Oahu, or what prompted his subsequent espousal of the cause of the Oahu chiefs, are matters which tradition has left to conjecture. Kamakahili's second husband, whom she had selected some years before, while her first was living, as was then the custom, was the gallant Keo, or Keolulani, the younger brother of Kahiliki. He was commended to her, not more though his princely blood than many accomplishments and graces of person, and she appears to have been greatly attached to him. She had 2 daughters with Leo, both of whom were of marriageable age when she became the wife of Keo. She was the granddaughter, it may be mentioned, of Lono Kahohu, a prince of Kauai, who in his younger years visited Hawaii, was accepted as a temporary husband of Kalani, the sister of Kauai, and through her became the grandfather of Keeaumoku and his 2 distinguished brothers. The daughters of the queen were Leimaholani and Kapamohu, the latter of whom, in marriage with Kamolai, the last independent king of Kauai, became the grandmother of the present queen, Kapolani. Keo took no part in the conquest of Oahu by his brother, but remained at Kauai, assisting the queen in her government, while Kanoneo found occupation first in aiding and then in opposing Kahiliki. Escaping from Oahu after the defeat of the rebellious chiefs, and death of Kanoneo, Kaiana presented himself before the Queen of Kauai, who was a distant relative, and Keo, who was of closer kinship, and related to them the story of Kahaliki's merciless operations on Oahu. He sought to create an active sympathy in favor of the unfortunate Oahuans, but Keo was too sagacious to place himself in hostility to his warlike brother, who had extended his sway over all the islands between Kauai and Hawaii. However, Kaiana was kindly received at the court of Kauai, and given lands for his proper maintenance, but he could not remain quiet. While the clash of arms was heard on the other islands, he chafed under the restraints of his exile, and attempted to organize a force of warriors for a descent upon Oahu. Keo prevented the departure of the expedition, however, and a mutual feeling of suspicion and antagonism was soon developed between him and his reckless and restless cousin. As the avenues to advancement through the chances of war seemed to be temporarily closed to him, Kaiana donned his best attire, gave entertainments, and began vigorously to play the courtier. He first sought to supplant Keo in the affections of the queen. Failing in that, he next paid court to her daughter, Kaku Manu. The latter was disposed to regard his suit with favor, but Keo, through the pretended service of a kaulua, objected to the alliance, and in a spirit of recklessness Kaiana embarked in the ship Nootka for China late in 1787. That vessel, in the course of trade, touched at Kauai just as the fortunes of Kaiana seemed to be the most desperate, and Captain Meares was easily prevailed upon to permit the handsome Hawaiian to accompany him to the Asiatic coast. Arriving in Canton, Kaiana spent some months in studying the arts of war and mingling with the people of strange races, and in the latter part of 1788 returned in the Iphigenia to Kauai, bringing with him a very considerable supply of muskets, powder, lead, and other munitions of war. As the manner in which he secured these supplies is not stated, we are constrained to believe that he must have taken with him to China a quantity of sandalwood which was readily marketable in that country. But Keo would not permit him to land on Kauai. The clouds had indicated approaching danger the day before, and Kaiana was told that he would be slain and sacrificed if his foot touched the shore. The vessel therefore sailed for Hawaii, where Kaiana landed and offered his services to Kamehameha. They were promptly accepted. His supply of arms and knowledge of other lands rendered him a valuable ally at the time, and Kamehameha gave him an important command and took him into his fullest confidence. This was early in 1789, and in the succeeding wars with Kiowa, Kaiana became an active leader, as already mentioned. The knives, hatchets, axes, and swords brought by him from China were found to be useful, but the firearms were generally of old patterns, and the most of them were soon rendered entirely unserviceable through the inability of the natives to keep them in repair. 5. Very soon after her marriage, Kaku Manu was detected in flagrant flirtations with a certain chiefs whose business brought them to the court of her husband, and Kamehameha set a close watch upon her actions. This led to bitter words between them, and in time it became a matter of gossip that Kamehameha was jealous of his young wife. The arrival of Deanna added another to the list of Kaahumanu admirers, and in time another wrinkle to the stern face of her warrior husband. Deanna was one of the handsomest chiefs of his day, and Kaku Manu could not disguise her infatuation for him. But whatever may have been the temptation, he was too discreet to awaken the jealousy of Kamehameha, and was not displeased when he was dispatched with an army against Kiowa in the distant district of Kau. After the death of Kaliopu in 1782, and the defeat and death of Keowalau, the widow of the former, whose name was Kaloa, left for Maui, taking with her the widow and infant daughter of Kiwalo. Kahilili, brother of Kalawa, provided for the family and gave them his protection. After the conquest of Oahu by Kahilili, he removed his court to that island, taking with him his sister and her family. In 1785, they returned to Maui with Kalakakulele, the son of Kalahilili, who had been appointed viceroy of the island, and there remained principally at Olowalu until 1790, when Kalalanupuli was driven from Maui by Kamehameha, and they sought refuge at Kalamalala on the island of Molokai. Seeing his way clear to the conquest of the group, and anxious to ally himself to the superior blood which came through Kaloa and Kiwalo, Kamehameha dispatched a messenger to Molokai, requesting Kaloa not return to Oahu, but to place herself and family under his protection. Following the messenger to Molokai, and learning that Kaloa was ill and not expected to recover, Kamehameha paid her a visit in person, and received the assurance of the dying dowager that, when she passed away, her daughter and granddaughter should be his. The granddaughter was Keopuolani, then a girl of 14. She subsequently became the wife of Kamehameha, and the mother of the ruling princess of his dynasty. In recognition of her superior rank, Kamehameha always approached her on his knees, even after she had become his wife, and the undisputed sovereign of the group. Such was the deference invariably paid to rank at that time and earlier. Kolawa did not live but a few days after her meeting with Kamehameha. At her death, he manifested his sorrow by knocking out 2 of his front teeth, and then formally took charge of and removed to Hawaii her daughter and granddaughter, not only as a sacred legacy from Kolawa, but as a token of reconciliation and alliance between himself and the elder branch of the Kauai dynasty. Kaku Manu well understood the meaning of this reconciliation, and it was with little pleasure that she welcomed Lihila and her daughter to Hawaii. She knew it was the purpose of Kamehameha to marry Keopuolani as soon as she reached a proper age, but she was childless and could urge no valid objection to the union. The thought of it, however, did not sweeten her temper or quicken her sense of propriety. She became more reckless, and her husband more and more suspicious, until they finally separated, when Kaku Manu returned to her father, where she remained for more than a year, and where, it is said, Deanna frequently visited her. Of these visits, Kamehameha was apprised by Keopuolani, the wife of Deanna, of whom tradition makes but spare mention. She was jealous of her husband's attentions to Kaku Manu, and it was through her that Kamehameha became aware of their secret meetings. His spies had overlooked what the jealous eyes of the wife had discovered, and it is intimated that they retaliated in kind upon the recreant couple. But that it may, Kamehameha sent for Kaku Manu, and through the offices of Captain Vancouver, whose vessel was at that time anchored in Kealakekua Bay, a reconciliation was effected between them. But Kamehameha did not forgive Deanna. His thoughts were bent upon the conquest of Oahu, and he needed his assistance in that important enterprise. But he determined to crush them whenever he could do so without injury to himself. Deanna felt the coldness of his chief, and had observed unmistakable evidences of his hatred. But he neglected no duty, and resolved that, if an open rupture could not be avoided, Kamehameha should not be in a position to urge a reason for that would command the respect and approval of his supporting chiefs. Summoning his district chiefs to muster their quotas of canoes and armed men, Kamehameha prepared for the conquest of Oahu and a final struggle for the mastery of the group. It is said that his army numbered 16,000 warriors, some of them armed with muskets, and that so great was the number of his canoes that they almost blackened the channels through which they passed. The army embarked from Hawaii early in 1795, and after touching at Lahaina for refreshments, landed for final preparation on Molokai, the fleet of canoes being distributed for miles along the coast. Kaea had promptly responded to the call of his chief, and was there with a heavy quota of warriors and canoes. A council of war was called at Kahu Kakai to discuss the plans of the campaign, but Deanna was not invited to participate in its proceedings. His exclusion from the council alarmed Deanna, and he suspected that he was the principal subject of discussion. He left his quarters, and calling on the house of Nahahana, the mother of Kaku Manu, learned from her that the council was discussing some private matter, the nature of which she did not know. He next visited Kaoleomuku after the adjournment of the council, and endeavored to ascertain what had been done. But the answers of the chief were evasive and unsatisfactory. He did not dare to tell Deanna, who was allied to him in blood, that Kamehameha had charged Deanna before the council with meditated treason, which implied his death, and that his advisers had prevailed upon him to allow the matter to rest until the conquest of Oahu. On his way back to Hamoloa, where his warriors were encamped, Deanna again passed the house of Namahana. It was past sunset, and he was striding through the dying twilight, his thoughts of a tumult of doubt and indignation, when from behind a clump of bushes he heard his name pronounced in a low tone. He stopped and listened, and Deanna again came to him in a soft voice. Fearful of treachery, he hesitated for a moment, then drew a knife from a scabbard hanging from his neck, and cautiously walked around the screening undergrowth. "Who calls?" inquired Deanna, observing a crouching figure among the bushes. "Your friend," was the answer, and Kaku Manu rose and stood before him. What passed between them can only be conjectured, but Kaku Manu must have satisfied Deanna of Kamehameha's hostile purposes concerning him, for when he reached his quarters, he promptly informed his brother Nahiole of the danger awaiting both of them, and apprised him of his resolution to abandon Kamehameha on the passage to Oahu and join forces with Kalaniʻupule. "The movement is hazardous," explained Deanna, "but it will enable us, at least, to die like chiefs, with arms in our hands instead of being slain like dogs." As the several divisions were preparing to embark for Oahu the next morning, Deanna visited the squadron of canoes set apart for the accommodation of the wives and daughters of Kamehameha and his principal chiefs, and secretly informed his wife of his purpose to join Kalaniʻupule. She expressed surprise at the announcement, but declined to follow him, declaring that she preferred to cast her fortunes with Kamehameha. "But," she continued bitterly, "perhaps Kaku Manu will follow you, if you ask to do so." Deanna made no reply to this cutting suggestion, but waved his wife a hasty farewell and joined his embarking warriors. The other divisions of the invading army were well out to sea before Deanna's sails were set, and he found no difficulty in making his way unobserved to Kailua, on the northern side of the island, while Kamehameha landed with the main body of his forces in the neighborhood of Honolulu, his canoes extending along the beach from Wailea to Waikiki. Disembarking his warriors at Kailua, to the number of perhaps 1,500, Deanna offered his services to Kalaniʻupule, whose army was rapidly occupying positions in the valleys back of Honolulu, the Moi receiving him with open arms, promising him the sovereignty of Maui should they succeed in destroying Kamehameha, and the united armies climbing over Nuuanu and Kalihi passes confronted the advancing lines of Kamehameha. Learning of the desertion of Deanna and the warriors under his command, Kamehameha exhibited but little surprise. He did not doubt his ability to defeat the combined armies of his opponents, for the auguries had been favorable and he had faith in his gods. Nor did he regret that through this defection Deanna had at last placed himself in a position to be dealt with as an open enemy. With his war god Kali in the van, Kamehameha, at the head of a mighty force, marched up Nuuanu Valley, where, 3 miles back of Honolulu, behind a stone wall stretching from one hill to the other of the narrowing gorge, was entrenched the main body of the allied armies, and behind the wall stood Deanna, grim, silent, and desperate, with a musket in his hand, awaiting the approach of Kamehameha. Nearer and nearer advanced the attacking column, with shouts that were repaid by yells of defiance from behind the defenses. A few volleys of musketry were exchanged by the 100 or more of warriors in possession of firearms on each side. But Deanna took no part in the noisy conflict. He was watching for the approach of one whose life he longed for more than all the rest, and for which he was willing to exchange his own. But he watched in vain. A field piece, under the direction of John Young, was brought to bear upon the wall, and Deanna fell with the first shot, mortally wounded. After a few more shots, the Hawaiians charged up the hill, their shouts drowning the roar of the breakers against the reef below. Deanna drew himself up against the wall. His heart had been laid almost bare, and his eyes were growing dim. With an effort he raised his musket, fired it at random in the direction of the storming column, hoping the bullet might by chance find the heart of Kamehameha, and then fell dead. The rout of the Hawaiians and their allies was complete. They broke and fled in all directions. Some were driven over the pali, a precipice 600 or 700 feet in height, at the head of the valley, and others escaped over the hills. Kaliipuli found refuge for a time in the mountains, but he was finally captured, slain, and offered as a sacrifice to Kamehameha's war god at Waikiki. This was the last battle of the conquest, and the victory gave to Kamehameha the sovereignty of the group, for the king of Kauai, recognizing his power, soon after yielded to him his peaceful allegiance. But it brought to a close the career of one of the most noted of modern Hawaiian chiefs, Deanna a Halua, over whose death Kamehameha rejoiced, and Kaku Manu mourned in silence. Her love proved fatal to more than one, but he was the grandest and brightest of all who perished by the sweet poison of her smiles. The Tomb of Puupehe, a legend of the island of Lanai. Sailing along the lee shore or southwest coast of Lanai, a huge block of red lava, 60 feet in diameter and 80 or more feet in height, is discerned standing out in the sea, and detached from the mainland some 50 or 60 fathoms. The sides are precipitous, offering no possible means of ascent, and against it the waves dash in fury, and in the niches of its storm-worn angles the birds of ocean build their nests. Observed from the overhanging bluff of the neighboring shore, on the summit of the lonely column is seen a small enclosure formed by a low but well-defined stone wall. This is known as the Tomb of Puupehe, the last resting place of one of the most beautiful of the daughters of Maui, whose body was buried there by her distracted husband and lover, Makakihau, a warrior of Lanai. How the summit was reached by the lover with his precious burden is a mystery, but the wall is still there to show that the ascent was made in some manner, and tradition assumes that it was through the agency of supernatural forces. Puupehe was the daughter of Uaua, a petty chief of Maui, and Makakihau won her. It is related without detail, as the joint prize of love and war. How this could have occurred it is difficult to imagine, since Lanai was always a dependency of Maui in the past, and no direct wars between the two islands are mentioned by tradition. It may therefore be inferred that she was the spoil of some private predatory expedition, and that the efforts of the young warrior to jealously seclude her from the gaze of men were prompted not more by the infatuations of her beauty than the fear that she might be recaptured. However this may have been, they are described in the Kanikau, or lamentation of Puupehe, as mutually captive to each other in the bonds of love. The maiden was a sweet flower of Hawaiian beauty. Her glossy brown and spotless body shone like the clear sun rising out of Haleakala. Her flowing hair, bound by wreaths of bikai blossoms, streamed forth as she ran like the surf crest scudding before the wind, and the starry eyes of the daughter of Uaua so dazzled the youthful brave that she was called Makakihu, or misty eyes. Fearing that the radiant beauty of the captive might cause her to be coveted by some of the chiefs of the land, he said to her, "We love each other well. Let us go to the clear waters of Kalkulu. There we will fish together for the kala and bonita, and there will I spear the turtle. I will hide you, O light of my heart, in the cave of Maluia, or we will dwell together in the great ravine of Palawai, where we will eat the young of the uwayu, and bake them in the tea leaf with the sweet pala root. The ohelo berries of Kulakiwa will refresh us, and we will drink of the cool waters of Manalei. I will thatch a hut in the thicket of Kuakai, and we will love on till the stars die." The Malays tell of their loves in the Pulu ravine, where they caught the bright iwi birds and scarlet apapani. How sweet were their joys in the Maya groves of Waikanakua, where the lovers caught naught so beautiful as themselves. But the misty eyes were soon to be made dimmer by weeping, and dimmer till the drowning brine should shut out their light forever. Makakeheu left his love one day in the cave of Malaua, while he went to the mountain to fill the Huawai with sweet water. This cavern yawns at the base of the cliff overlooking the rock of Puapei. The sea surges far within, but there is an inner space or chamber which the expert swimmer can reach, and where Puapei had often found seclusion, and baked the honu, or sea turtle, for her absent lover. This was the season for the Kona, the terrific storm that comes up from the equator, and hurls the billows of ocean with increased violence against the southern shores of the Hawaiian Islands. Makakeheu beheld from the rocky springs of Polo the vanguard of an approaching Kona, scuds of rain and thick mist rushing with the howling wind across the round valley of Palawai. He knew the storm would fill the cave with a wild and sudden rush of waters, and destroy the life of his beautiful Puapei. Every moment was precious. He flung aside his calabashes of water, and at the top of his speed started down the mountain. With mighty and rapid strides he crossed the great valley, where he met the coming storm in its fury. Over the rim he dashed with an agonized heart, and down the ragged slope of the Kula to the shore, which the waves were already lashing in a voice of thunder. The sea was up, indeed. The yeasty foam of surging, wind-rent billows whitened the cliffs, and the tempest chorused the mad anthem of the battling waves. Oh, where should misty eyes seek for his love in the blinding storm? A rushing mountain of sea fills the mouth of the cave of Malua, and the pit air within hurls back the invading torrent with a stubborn roar, blowing outward great streams of spray. It is a savage war of the elements, a battle of the forces of nature well calculated to thrill with pleasure the hearts of strong men. But a lover looking into the seething gulf of the whirlpool, what would be to him the sublime conflict? What to see amid the boiling brine the upturned face and tender body of the idol of his heart? Others might agonize on the brink, but misty eyes sprang into the dreadful cauldron and snatched his lifeless love from the jaws of an ocean grave. The next day fishermen heard the lamentation of Makakehau, and the women of the valley came down and wailed over Puapei. They wrapped her body in bright new kapa, and covered it with garlands of fragrant now. They prepared it for interment, and were about to place it in the burial ground of Manalei, But Makakakihau prayed that he might be left alone one night more with his lost love, and the request was not refused. When the women returned the morning following, they found neither corpse nor wailing lover. At length, looking toward the rock of Pupahi, they discovered Makakeo at work on the lofty apex of the Lone Sea Tower. The wondering people of the island watched him with amazement from the neighboring cliffs, but heedless of their observation, he continued his labors. Some sailed round the base of the column in their canoes, but could discover no means of ascent. Every face of the rock was either perpendicular or overhanging. The conviction then became general, since there seemed to be no other possible explanation, that some sympathizing akua, or spirit, had responded to the prayer of Makakehu, and assisted him in reaching the summit of the tower with the body of his dead bride, and in this form his tradition brought down the touching story. Makakeho finished his labors. He laid his love in a grave prepared by his own hands, placed the last stone upon it, and then stretched out his arms and thus wailed for Pupahi. Where are you, O Pupahi? Are you in the cave of Malalea? Shall I bring you sweet water, the water of the fountain? Shall I bring you the Uwa, the Palea, and Ohio? Are you baking the Hanu, and the red sweet Hala? Shall I pound the Kalo of Maui? Shall we dip in the gourd together? The bird and the fish are bitter, and the mountain water is sour. I shall drink it no more. I shall drink with a pui, the great shark of Manele. Ceasing his sad wail, Makakehu gazed for a moment upon the grave where buried the light and hope of his life, and then leapt from the rock into the boiling surge at his base. His body was crushed in the breakers. The witnesses of the sacrifice secured the mangled remains of the dead lover, and interred them with respect in the kupapu of Manele. This is the story told by the old bards of Lanai, of the lonely rock of Pupahi, and the still inaccessible summit, with the marks of a grave upon it, attests with reasonable certainty that the mele has something of a foundation in fact.
Black Clock Audio Tales is edited and produced by D.B. Spitzer in Badger's Drift Studios in Portland, Oregon. You can contact us at pgttcm.com, on Facebook at Black Clock Audio Tales, and just look for us, Black Clock Audio Tales. Thank you.